We could have used a little of that cloud cover we had this morning. So I'm not going to keep y'all too long, but I'm going to go quickly through some of my career highlights and what Noxubee County put into me to help me succeed at that. Okay, Russ was the guy that came up with the idea to have the art show here. And he started, we were going to do it maybe at Ruby Cats or something like that, and then Esther came along and said, well, let's do it at the Historical Society, which was a great idea. So I want to thank Russ for coming up with the idea. Esther has gone way beyond on this deal, put this great event together. So I want to thank her especially. Anderson Thomas for allowing us to do this and getting behind it. The whole Historical Society. Lisa Hines did the food, so I really want to thank her. Honey Boy Boots. When I found out y'all were going to play, I was like, man, this is turning into kind of a big deal. You know, really. And so I just want to talk a little bit about, well, one, they said an afternoon with Homer Jolly. I think it's called Homer Jolly Bragging Day. Because I'm going to do a little bragging, so just bear with me. But anyway, Esther asked me early on, what about Noxubee County inspired you to become an artist? And I thought about it, and I said, well, you know, there wasn't a lot in Noxubee County that inspired me to become an artist. We had Betty George was an artist, maybe one other one that I knew that made a living or made money at being an artist. So it wasn't that. It's what Noxubee County instilled in me that allowed me, when I started pursuing my dream, to succeed at it, which was, you know, having respect for everyone and using the words yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, you know, having manners, and when you went for those interviews, and perseverance. And I got a lot of lucky opportunity, but I was there ready to go to work when that opportunity came up. And so I'll go through a few things. But anyway, we mostly grew up as farmers' kids, a lot of us, so we worked hard. So we had a work ethic too, and that meant a lot. I went to Mississippi State, and I got there and I doodled a lot. And if you go through the back room, has my career, you'll see some of my college doodles. And my teachers used to say, if you just apply yourself, you can do anything you want. So I decided to apply myself to my doodles. And I quit college. I called my parents. I'm quitting college. I'm going to be an artist. I want to say Dad said, you're on your own, son. But he didn't. He didn't. He didn't, you know, he was against it, but he got on board, and so did my mom. And that was another thing. I had great parents. You know, as I've gone out into the world and met people who just weren't lucky enough to have that upbringing, it means much more to me now because of that. So anyway, I started trying to find my first job, you know, and I was working, I had to have a job, so I started working for Pete Conner. He gave me a job as a carpenter's helper in Columbus, Mississippi. So I was doing that and met Tim Perkins, who was a friend of mine, and his dad owned Monroe Tough Line. And he said, you know, my dad needs a draftsman. I can get you an appointment, see if you can do that. So I went with him. That was one of my first breaks. Mr. Perkins walked me into the room where they draft and draw their parts and everything, and said, do you think you can do this? And I'd never been in a drawing room in my life. I'd never seen a drafting board. I'd never seen drafting tools. And I said, yes, sir, I think I can. Yes, sir. And I want to get to it later, but the two most important times I ever said yes, sir, in my life happened in one day. And I'll get to that a little later. But anyway, I worked for Monroe Tough Line, drew parts, succeeded with them, even because I was a farmer, helped them design a piece of equipment that they still make to this day, a V-plow. Then I went on a trip, helped a girl move down to Fort Lauderdale, Gina Whitehead, and I had a friend in Naples, Florida, Ken Atkins, and Gina drove me over there and let me stay for a few days. She's going to come back and get me. While we were there, I met this kid, John Bupani, this Italian kid that was raised in New York, but they were living in Naples, and he took us to a party in Fort Myers. And we're at the party, and this guy's talking, Fred Scala, and he's going, you know, I'm busy and I need an artist, but I can't afford a college-trained artist. And I said, well, and I always took my drawings with me. Once I started trying to become an artist, I always took my work, whatever I had, with me somewhere, just in case an opportunity arises. And that opportunity arose, and he said, well, bring your drawings back up tomorrow, and if you got the hands, kid, you got the job. If you got the hands, you got the job. I took the stuff back up, and he said, go home, pack your stuff up in Mississippi, and move back down. You got a job. And so he taught me commercial art, how to create art for camera ready. There were no computers back then, so it was all hand-drawn, hand-done. He had t-shirt huts all over South Florida, and I learned to design t-shirts. And I hurt myself. I was working nights at a restaurant because I wasn't making a ton of money because he was training me. And I went to him and said, I hurt my shoulder, and they told me not to be moving it for the next week or so. And Fred got kind of skippy with me and said, well, come back in 2 weeks and see if you still have a job. 2 days later in Naples, the guy tells me, oh, Doyle Workinger is looking for an artist. So I went to see him. He hired me on the spot. He needed an artist, and that was a small ad agency, and I worked there for 3 years in Naples, Florida. I went to Washington, D.C., and Keith hadn't made it yet. He's coming, but Keith Hurd's wedding in D.C., and I got to D.C., and I'm like, man, if there's this much happening here, there's got to be twice as much in New York. That's really what I was thinking. And his new brother-in-law worked at a big agency, Young and Rubicam in New York, and I had my work with me in D.C. So I went and looked at it. He looked at it and he said, yeah, you could probably work in New York. You're good enough to work in New York. So I got back home and I told my parents, I'm moving to New York. And my mom says, you're going to get killed. And that's true story. You're going to get killed. But anyway, Keith Hurd said, call Paul Hatchett. He's living in New York. And I called Paul. I knew him from college. And I said, Paul, I'm thinking about moving to New York. And he said, well, come on. We won't let you sleep on the street. And about 2 weeks later, he called me back and said, you're in luck. I'm being transferred to D.C. for 4 months. You can have my apartment free. Now, the thing about New York, jobs are hard to find for creative people because every creative person in the world at that time wanted to work there. But apartments were even harder to find. So I didn't have to look for an apartment. I had it free for 4 months. So that's good. I don't have a job by then. So I moved up there. My parents took me to Tuscaloosa. I had 2 Foot Lockers and put me on an Amtrak train. I'd never been north of Washington, D.C. I rode the Amtrak train. Of course, I kept looking for New York because you go underground about 20 miles from New York, so you don't really see it. All I could see were the World Trade Centers and the Empire State Building. And I came out into Penn Station, which is the busiest train station in the world, probably. And man, everything was moving. The people were moving this fast. They were going everywhere. And I got to find out where do I find my trunks? How do I get my check bags? I found that. I got out on the street and it was moving even faster. Horns honking, sirens going off, people moving as fast. And I had that note, 320 East 42nd Street. Took me there, I went straight in. And so every day for about a week, I didn't know any neighborhood. So I would start walking west from the east side of Manhattan. And I'd walk until I started feeling a little unsafe in an area. And then I'd turn around and walk back. I'd walk north about 20, 30 blocks until I didn't feel safe. And I did that until I felt like I could get on a bus. And I'd take the bus into the neighborhood. As you can see, I didn't get on trains until I knew, because you're underground, you don't know where you're coming up at. You can come up anywhere. But I started going to the library. There was no internet back then, no computers. And I would look up ad agencies and call and get appointments with these ad agencies. And I would set up, for the next week and be going to 3 or 4 appointments a day sometimes. And I went about 6 months, and I was almost out of money. I didn't have very much money. I was eating pizza every day, $1 a slice, a can of Coca-Cola. Sometimes 3 times a day. And the beauty was I wasn't having to pay rent, so I could do it. And I remember they had agencies that would place creative people, so I started interviewing with them. And I went to one, and it didn't go well, and I wasn't ready, I was young, I was raw, and I was standing out by the elevator, and I swear I was about to cry. And I don't cry over bad stuff, I cry over good stuff, which I'm about to do now. and this executive came out of the washroom and was headed to his office, and I could tell he was probably the head of the group. And he saw me, he kind of turned to me, looked at me, and said, "You will work in New York." And that picked me up enough because I was about to buy a bus ticket back home. I mean, that's where I was. And that kept me going, and about a month later, I had an appointment at Nielsen Design Associates, and they did a lot of work for men, you know, speed spray, packaging and stuff like that. And it snowed 14 inches overnight, and New York was paralyzed. And I got out in my Mississippi shoes and trudged over there. It was only about 3.5 blocks, and you know, I was wet from here down by the time I got there. It looked like, I won't use my cuss words. Anyway, I went in, and it was a little receptionist desk with nobody at it, an office with the main guy sitting there, and then a big bullpen that had art boards all around it, and there were only 2 guys in there. And I sat down and interviewed with Ken, and he said, "Can you work today?" And I said, "Yes, sir." That was the most important "yes, sir" I ever said in my life, because that was the first day I worked as a New York graphic artist in my dream. And I sat down, and what I didn't know was New York does not stop because of a snowstorm. You still have deadlines. They had a huge deadline with Menon, their biggest client, and had to get it done that day. And about 3 people couldn't show up to work because of the snowstorm. I was nervous. I'm like, I know what I'm doing. These guys are from New York. They work here, and I'm watching them out of the corner of my eye, how they're doing it. I'm trying to, you know, do what I was told to do. You know, but anyway, we worked into the night. When I went to leave, Ken said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And those were 2 most important yes, sirs I ever said in my life, because that started my career right there, and it just kept going from there. I worked for them freelance in a few other places for about 6 months, and I got an interview with Kingfisher Syndicate, which syndicates the comic strips, you know, Betty Boop, Hagar, Beetle Bailey, all of those, all the well-known ones. And I was like, oh my God, I'd like to work for people I used to read every day, you know. And the art director really wanted to move on into the computer department, which was just starting. That one PCs, that personal computers, that was mainframes. That's what they were using to do typesetting for all our articles and everything like that. And he said, I'm trying to find somebody to replace me, which said, okay, I'm getting an assistant art director's job. As soon I can be the art director. And that happened. I went to work for him. In 6 months, I was the art. He moved on. I was the art director. And I remember my first week as the art director, we were sitting in the boardroom. I got invited to a meeting, and they were interviewing ad agencies to create our booklet that sells all our products. Kingfisher syndicated, you know, columns, sewing patterns, you know, that they put in newspapers. They syndicate that stuff all over the world. Newspapers, you know, Dear Abby, stuff like that. And Heloise, I know Heloise, you know her. And so I got invited to that meeting, and I was sitting in there, and I'm in the board meeting, you know, and there are all these powerful guys around the Kingfisher going, I'm a pretty big shot. You know, here I am, I was feeling my goats, you know. And before we'd gone up, my boss, who was the director of advertising, had told me, like, we're interviewing these agencies, you know, to do our catalog and design a nice catalog and everything like that. And we want your opinion on them. And I said, well, why aren't we doing it in-house? We have the people. And he's like, it's too much. We don't want to do it in-house. We want to farm it out. So we go to the meeting. I'm sitting there and I'm listening to, they're describing the agencies. And they were going to have to come back and, you know, we're going to give them parameters, and they were going to come back with the bids and what it's going to cost and everything like that. And we're sitting there, and at the end of it, when they got through talking about the agencies, the executive vice president, Alan Creel, said, well, are we going to let Homer take a stab at it? And before they could say anything, I said, I certainly hope so. And he said, well, yes, we want your bid too. And I could tell both the director of advertising and Claudia, that worked for him, were not really happy with me. And they kind of shunned me for a little bit, but I started working on it by myself. And then when I got what I thought was going to be a good design, I went to them and said, okay, how do we fill this out? And they got on board, and we printed the brochure. I saved them about $500,000 of agency fees and things like that, because we did everything in-house. We printed the booklet and won an award for printing in excellence in New York. And we were getting telexes, which that's what they had back then, not emails, it was telexes, from all over the world. Editors going, what a great book, you've outdone yourself. And that got me a raise, you know. And so I did great work with Key Features, loved every bit of it. And I talked about opportunity earlier, so I've worked for Key Features about 2.5, 3 years. And I used to get the tickets for our boxing to the Mets all the time, because when I first got there, the Mets looked terrible. But then they traded to get Gary Carter, and then they got Keith Hernandez, some of y'all won't know, some of you will. And they started bringing up these young pitchers, Dwight Gooden, and then Darryl Strawberry was a rookie and all of that. And they started getting really good, so other people wanted to go, but the president would always give me the tickets, because I went when nobody wanted. So one day I'm out there, and King Features is owned by the Hearst Corporation. They're the parent company. Hearst Entertainment, which is their television division, was in the same building, but up on the 16th floor. And I went to the game, and Bruce Paisner, who was the president of Hearst Entertainment, brought his son. And I had kept, the baseball, what do you call it? Chart where you base hit, era, blah, blah, blah. I did that in high school. So I was teaching Bruce's son how to do that the whole game. And at the end of the game, I saw an opportunity, and I just leaned over and said, Bruce, if you ever have you need somebody creative, I'd love to work in entertainment. And I went on my way. About a month later, I got a call. I guess he called and checked me out. He says, you still want to work in the entertainment industry? I said, yes, sir. And he brought me up, and he explained to me, we're about to syndicate Dr. Ruth. All us older people know who Dr. Ruth is. And kind of a risque personality, that was more scientific about her subject than she was risque. And he says, we've got to have all this stuff done in 60 days. And I looked down, it's like 30-second commercial, 20-second, brochures, all this stuff. And I said, well, how much of this has been done? And he says, none of it. I'm like, he says, you think you can do it? And I said, yes, sir, I think I can. I'd never made a commercial in my life. I'd never even been on the set of shooting a commercial. So we did have an agency of record for Hearst Entertainment, so then I'd met them before, and I called them up and I said, how do we do this? And they said, don't worry, just come on, we'll get it done. And so we got it all done, and in the final editing of one of her commercials, it was a camera of a couple in bed, one's reading, the wife's thinking one thing, and their thoughts are coming up on the screen, they're both thinking opposite things. And it zooms down, and Dr. Ruth is on the end of the bed and giving her spiel about, couples and having a relationship. And we showed it to her, and she says, I look squatty in that. I don't like that. I can't approve that. I look really squatty in it. And so, Bruce says, we got to do something to change it. And I said, Bruce, one, I don't know if we can do anything in post to change it, but I'll talk to the people and see what we can do. And if we can't change it, have to reshoot, we're missing all the deadlines. So I went to see the guys in post, and they said, no, we can't do anything. But I tell you what we've done before. We've shown them the same thing again and told them we worked on it in post, and most of the time they agree, yeah. So I made a big decision that I would have gotten fired for it if it had not worked out. And we did it. And when we showed it to Dr. Ruth, she says, oh, much better, much better. She had that German accent. So I got away with that one. And anyway, Dr. Ruth hated me. I had an office, and the director of development had an office. Jim Pursley, he produced Dr. Ruth, and I was director of advertising at this point first. And I remember one day walking down the hall with Jim, and Dr. Ruth's coming. She stopped and she says, Jim, what a beautiful, beautiful sweater. Nice sweater, Homer. Sweater guy. But anyway, I've met a lot of people through her. She interviewed, Medicine Woman or whatever. What's her? Jane Seymour. I met her. I met a lot of celebrities through that show. It was a lot of fun. But anyway, that all was going great. I worked for Hearst, and I'll tell a couple of stories when I was there. One, we did MIP and MIPCOM, which is right around the Cannes Film Festival in Cannes. So I was beginning to get to travel on their dime, I'd never been to Europe. And that was a great opportunity, to get over here and do all that. It was just a great time. And then one time, I'll tell you, Bill, and this is when you find out how much you like them, people like you. I decided to go on a ski trip to Aspen. And I left the office Thursday afternoon without letting anybody know, and took a flight the next morning. Allie that picked me up at the airport's there, and I hear over the loudspeaker, "Homer Jolly, please come to the information booth. You have a phone call." How do they know I'm here? Well, my secretary knew I was. And Bill Miller says, "Call him immediately. He's the executive vice president of First Entertainment." And I get on the phone with him. "Hey, Bill, this is Homer." He says, "Homer, where are you?" I said, "Bill, you know where I am. You called me here." And he said, "Well, you need to get on a plane and get back to New York right away." And he used some other words. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, we signed Linda Ellerby, who back then, I don't know if y'all remember her, but she was a big newswoman back in the day, and we were going to do a news show with her." And he said, "And Bruce wants to put out a press release today." And I said, "Bill, I can't get back on the plane right now and fly back to New York." And he says, "Well, you do what you got to do, Homer." And I hung up the phone. And I told Allie, I said, "This is when you find out how much they like you. Because I'm either fired or I'm going to keep my job." Monday morning, I'd already figured out what I was going to say. When I went into Hearst Entertainment, it was a long hallway with all the secretaries that were out in the hallway. And you could have heard a pin drop when I walked down that hall. No good mornings, no hey Homer, nothing. And I walked into his office, and he went at me. He was like, "You didn't tell anybody where you were going." I'm like, "Well, yeah, they don't want to know where I was going." And he said, "Well, we got to get this press release out today." And I said, "One, Bill, if we'd have put the press release out on Friday, no one would have picked it up because no one reads the Saturday paper in the New York Times. You know, it's Monday through Friday and the Sunday paper. Saturday is nothing. Two, we can't put our press release without it going through corporate first for approval, and that's going to take a week or two." And he was still, but anyway, that's exactly what it took. It took about 2 weeks to get the press release out because it had to be approved by the president of Hearst and all of that. So I got past that little deal, and right then I started thinking, one, since I became an artist, which that's what I want to do, and I've been moving up, I don't even do art anymore. I'm just going to meetings and directing other people. And I'm like, I really want to start doing art. So I went to Bill Miller and I said, "Look, I really want to," this was of course a year or so after Ellerby, but I'm like, "I'm really thinking about moving to Jackson, Mississippi and start my own design studio." And what I've done for them, I've done the same thing at King Features. I brought freelancers in and we created all their movie posters and stuff like that without an ad agency. So I was saving them a lot of money. And so Bill looked at me, the same guy that cussed me out, looked at me and says, "I tell you what, we're going to mark this date, and if you'll do our work for Jackson and can keep up the work, I'll pay your salary until this date the next year." And that's what they did, and that allowed me to, start my agency. And I stayed in Jackson, and it really wasn't, I wanted to go back to New York, so I went back and I was freelanced, and I had an agent that was getting me work. Now this is when personal computers now were beginning to become the way that designed everything. And I had a beta version of Photoshop, that ages me. But, and I was very good at Photoshop. So I was doing work for Sports Illustrated. I had an agent, they were getting the work, and I would do it in my apartment and send it out, making great money. And that went on for about 8 years, and then I decided to move to Pensacola. And I've been in Pensacola for 25 years now, and I've lived there longer than I've lived anywhere in my life. And Pensacola is a beautiful place. And I started, I was still doing work in New York. Moved in 2000. Well, in 2000, when 9/11 happened, my work from New York cut off that day. And I wasn't worried. It'll come back in a month. I was playing golf every day. That turned into about 3 months, and my bank account's doing this. And I got to find work. And I talked to Collier Merrill, who develops condos, and he's like, "Homer, I have to send all my 3D renderings down to South America and get them done. It takes this and that, and people make changes. It's 2 weeks. You don't see it. Can you do that?" And I said, "Well, I've done a lot of 3D work. I'll give it a shot." And I did good at it. And so I started doing a lot of work for condo developers. And I also started designing restaurants. I designed about 6 restaurants in Pensacola. two I'm most proud of are the zoo restaurant, the Gulf Shore Zoo, and the two wine bars I've done in Pensacola, which has all my art. So I got involved in the Bob Marley restaurant because of my work in Pensacola at restaurants. And we designed a beautiful, it's in there, in the back room will be my career. It's in chronological order, you know. And it was a beautiful site. It didn't get built, or hasn't yet, but it caught the notice of a guy that was on the board of the Alabama Gulf Coast Zoo. And he was working on the team with the Bob Marley. And he says, come on, take a ride with me, Homer. And we rode out, and they had 25 acres had been donated by Clyde Ware to put the new zoo on. The new zoo was destroyed by Ivan. I don't know if y'all remember, but they got Patty, the general manager, was named Person of the Week by ABC News because she saved all the animals except Chucky, the big 12-foot alligator. They couldn't find him. And there were sightings all over. Everybody said, oh, I saw him out in the lagoon, I saw him out in the lagoon. But when they finally got back in there, he was right where they feed him every day. You know. And so he drove me out there and looked at me and said, how would you like to design a zoo? I said, yes, sir. And so he was the lead on the project, and I was the lead designer. We hired the architects. They did what we wanted. And it was a 4-year project. It opened in 2020, right 2 weeks before COVID, and then had to shut down. And it was the crowning achievement of my career. I still walk out there and just, you know, get tears in my eyes thinking about that. Oh, I got to design a zoo. You know? First zoo built in America in over 25 years. As a matter of fact, Anderson came down. We were trying to figure out how to fund this zoo. And Anderson came down because I said, well, I know some guys in Mississippi have a lumber company, you know, they might be able to help us somehow or tell us. And, you know, we did the spiel, right? And they were willing, but at that right after that, the reason we weren't back was the bonds started happening. And we talked to the mayor, and we started putting together presentations, and Nuveen came in and issued a bond. The bond gave us $17 million to build a zoo, which is, we met that deadline. We met that budget. We didn't go over. And but the bond was $25 million. And we were like, where's the rest of this money going to? We started looking at Rob James, whatever, but Bob James, his son from, you know, governor of Alabama, he had his hand in it. The lawyers all had their hand in it. They all got a lot of money. You know,
what's wrong with that?
Okay, Keith.
We know that.
Now we know.
And but anyway, we got the zoo built. It's the crowning achievement of my career. I'm very proud of it. Thank you all. You don't know what this means.